In the summer of 1940, the world was basically holding its breath. France had just collapsed, Nazi flags were flying across most of Europe, and Britain was standing alone, staring down the storm. It looked like the war might be over before it really got started. But in Rome, one guy thought this was his big moment. Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, wasn't just watching events unfold, he was dreaming big, like ancient Rome big. He wanted a comeback tour for the Roman Empire. He called it Mare Nostrum, our sea, meaning the Mediterranean would basically become Italy's private pool. And sitting right in the middle of that dream was Egypt, not just because of the land, but because of the Suez Canal. That canal was the British Empire's lifeline. Shut that down, and you don't just bruise Britain, you choke it. On paper, this looked like a power move, a headline-grabbing, history book kind of win. Mussolini stacked the deck. In Libya, Italy assembled the 10th Army, around 150,000 troops ready to roll. Tanks, artillery, the works. Across the border in Egypt, just 36,000 British troops, the Western Desert Force, trying to cover a massive stretch of sand with a fraction of the manpower. If you're just looking at numbers, this feels like a blowout. Like kickoff hasn't even happened, and the scoreboard already says game over. But here's the thing, war isn't played on paper. And what looked like a guaranteed victory was about to turn into one of the most embarrassing disasters of the entire war. The first step toward a new Roman Empire was about to sink straight into the desert sand.
But this whole grand imperial flex, it wasn't about to end in glory. There were no Italian legions marching into Cairo with flags flying and victory speeches echoing through the streets. Instead, this dream of a new empire was about to implode hard. What looked like an easy win would spiral into one of the most humiliating collapses of the entire war. And here's the crazy part. On paper, Italy had every advantage. Bigger army, more men, more equipment. It should have been a steamroll, but the desert had other plans. Within months, that massive force would be shattered, thousands surrendering, entire positions collapsing like dominoes. The road that was supposed to lead to empire ended up leading straight to disaster. So what actually went wrong? Because this wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't one unlucky battle or one wrong turn. What happened in North Africa exposed something deeper, cracks that had been hiding inside Italy's war machine the whole time. The invasion didn't fail in a single dramatic moment. It unraveled, slowly, painfully, almost unbelievably. And once it started falling apart, there was no stopping it.
To understand how this thing crashed and burned, you've got to understand the size of the dream. Benito Mussolini didn't see himself as just another European leader. In his mind, he was a modern-day Caesar. Italy wasn't some secondary power tagging along. It was supposed to be the rebirth of ancient Rome. Since the 1920s, fascist Italy had been expanding, tightening its grip on Libya and invading Ethiopia to prove it could still conquer like the old empire. It was brutal, it was aggressive, and it fed Mussolini's confidence. Then 1940 hit, and Adolf Hitler started tearing through Europe, one victory after another. And that's when the pressure kicked in. Mussolini couldn't just sit on the sidelines while Germany grabbed all the headlines. He needed his own wins, his own spotlight. He called it a parallel war, Italy fighting alongside Germany, but scoring its own glory. When he officially jumped into the war on June 10, 1940, he genuinely believed it was a safe bet. France was collapsing. Britain looked isolated. He thought the whole conflict would wrap up in weeks, and he wanted a chair at the peace table when the map got redrawn. Egypt was the crown jewel. Controlled by Britain, it sat at the crossroads of empire, the oil routes of the Middle East, the lifeline to India, and right at its heart, the Suez Canal, the shortcut that kept the British Empire stitched together. If Italy took Egypt, it wouldn't just be a military win, it would be a symbolic punch straight to London's gut. It would make Mussolini's Mare Nostrum fantasy feel real. So Italy stacked up the 10th Army in Libya under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani. After France fell, the force swelled to 10 divisions. On paper, it looked massive, a heavyweight lineup staring down a much smaller British force across the border. From Rome, the road to Alexandria probably looked wide open. But here's where the illusion starts to crack. An army isn't just numbers on a chart. The British force in the desert was led by General Archibald Wavell, a quiet, calculating commander who understood something the Italians didn't yet grasp. And under him was Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, aggressive, sharp, and willing to take risks. Their western desert force was smaller, yeah, but it was almost entirely motorized. Trucks, armored cars, and mobile artillery. In the North African desert, that wasn't a luxury, that was survival. Out there, mobility was everything. You couldn't just march in neat lines and expect the sand to cooperate. British patrols would roll out across the border, hit isolated Italian outposts, grab prisoners, gather intel, and disappear back into the heat haze before anyone could react. It wasn't a full-scale war yet, but it was a warning, a preview. Rome saw a numbers game. The British saw a battlefield that rewarded speed, flexibility, and nerve. And as the Italian army prepared to push into Egypt, convinced victory was basically guaranteed, the desert was waiting. And the desert doesn't care about imperial dreams.
The guy in charge of this grand invasion wasn't some rookie. He'd carved his reputation in Libya and Ethiopia, brutal and ruthless. But underneath all that, he was riddled with doubt. He'd taken command after his predecessor, the legendary aviator Italo Balbo, got tragically shot down by his own anti-aircraft guns over Tobruk. Yeah, shot by his own side. Right from the start, Graziani was screaming to Mussolini that his army was a giant with feet of clay, massive on paper, but short on trucks, supplies, and the kind of modern gear you actually need to cross hundreds of miles of desert. Mussolini? He didn't care. From his marble palace in Rome, all he saw were numbers and maps. Glory. He wanted a headline victory to rival Hitler's conquests. Finally, he threw down an ultimatum. Hit Egypt by September 13th, or you're out. Graziani had no choice. He obeyed. So on September 13th, 1940, the Italian 10th Army slogged across the Egyptian border. But this wasn't a blitzkrieg. There were no lightning tanks, no daring flanks, just 4 divisions inching forward along a single coastal road, a slow, vulnerable snake of men and machines stretching for miles. Most soldiers were on foot, burning under the desert sun. The Royal Air Force harassed them non-stop, and the Royal Navy shelled the road from the sea like it was a practice target. After 4 grueling days, barely 60 miles in, they hit Sidi Barrani, and then Graziani did the unthinkable. He stopped. The Great Invasion froze in place. On paper, it made sense. Stretched supply lines, desperate need for water, food, and fuel. Forward bases had to be built, a water pipeline extended, defensive camps constructed to cover the flank. Prudence, he thought. In reality, he handed the British the perfect gift: time. Time to rest, to reinforce, and most importantly, time to plan. The Italian army ground to a halt not because Britain beat them. They just ran out of gas, bogged down by their own weight. What should have been a sweeping conquest turned into a slow-motion disaster, waiting to explode. To really get why this whole Italian adventure blew up, you've got to look at the men running the show. At the top was Benito Mussolini. Il Duce wasn't a military mastermind. He was a showman. He made moves based on ego and headlines, not battlefield realities. His constant meddling and insane deadlines put his generals in impossible spots. The fascist system rewarded loyalty over skill, so no one dared tell him the truth. When Graziani warned the army was under-equipped, Mussolini didn't solve anything. He threatened to fire him. Fear became the chain around the command. Obedience trumped initiative, and caution replaced boldness. On the ground, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani embodied the paralysis. Known for aggression in colonial wars, he froze against the British. He planned meticulously in a war that demanded improvisation and guts. And intelligence reports only made it worse. The Italians wildly overestimated the British forces. Graziani thought he was outnumbered, which fed his caution and slowed everything to a crawl. The halt at Sidi Barrani and the construction of separate fortified camps, classic mistake. They were supposed to support each other, but were spaced too far apart. Little islands of Italian strength in a sea of desert, static in a war that was all about movement. Fear drove the strategy. Fear of being outflanked, fear of stretching too far, fear of the unknown. He was fighting a World War I-style war in a World War II battlefield. That fear and rigidity trickled down.
Junior officers weren't supposed to think for themselves, so when commanders hesitated, the whole army froze. The Italian 10th Army was perfectly built for set-piece battles, not the fast, fluid desert war the British were about to unleash. From Mussolini's marble offices to Graziani's dusty headquarters, the leadership had crafted a giant with no brain, and it was about to stumble spectacularly.
In the desert, an army doesn't march on courage alone. It marches on water, fuel, and ammo. And for Italy, that lifeline was a total mess from the start. Logistics wasn't just a headache, it was a full-on nightmare dragging Mussolini's grand plans into the sand. Italy simply wasn't built for a modern, sustained war. Factories were small, resources limited, and the economy couldn't keep up with Britain or Germany. Every drop of fuel, every bullet, every can of food had to sail across the Mediterranean to Libya, Tripoli, Benghazi, before it could even reach the front. And the Brits? They were hunting those supply ships like sharks. The Regia Marina, Italy's navy, fought bravely, but without radar, they were practically blind at night or in bad weather, facing a Royal Navy that could see every move coming. Even the supplies that made it to Libya faced a brutal journey to the front. The 10th Army was mostly infantry on foot. Trucks? Not enough to move water, ammo, or food efficiently. The farther they went, the weaker their supply lines became. Trucks became endless shuttles, desperately running back and forth just to keep the army alive. That's the real reason Graziani froze at Sidi Barrani. He didn't stop because he was lazy. He stopped because the army literally couldn't go any further. The water pipeline? That was a desperation fix for a problem that should have been solved before the invasion even began. Meanwhile, the British had a secret weapon: speed. Their army was almost entirely motorized. They could move men and supplies faster than the Italians could dream of. Broken tanks or vehicles? No problem. They patched them up in field workshops and sent them back into action. That ability to bounce back made every Italian weakness even more glaring. In short, the Italian invasion of Egypt was doomed before it truly began. They were a car sent on a long journey with only a quarter tank of gas. Numbers and bravery couldn't make up for it. Logistics had already broken the 10th Army before they even met the British, and the desert was ready to watch it all collapse.
If Mussolini's leadership was a joke and logistics were a dumpster fire, the final nail in the coffin was Italian gear. The soldiers heading into the desert in 1940 were basically armed with museum pieces. It was like sending a kid to a gunfight with a slingshot. And in a modern mechanized war, that was a death sentence. Take the tanks. Italy's armored force was mostly the L3/35 tankette and the M11/39 medium tank. The L3, a tiny metal box with a couple of machine guns, fine for colonial policing, terrible against a real army. The M11/39 was slightly better, but the main gun was stuck in the hull. That meant to aim, the whole tank had to turn. Both were thin, fragile, and prone to breaking down in the desert heat. Now meet the British tanks. The cruisers were fast, but the real nightmare was the Matilda. Slow? Yeah, like a tortoise, but armored like a fortress. Italian shells bounced off it like rain on a tin roof, and its 2-pounder gun? Deadly to anything Italy had. To Italian crews, these Matildas weren't tanks, they were monsters crawling across the sand, unstoppable. And it wasn't just armor. Italian rifles were ancient Carcanos from 1891. Machine guns jammed in the dust. Artillery? A weird mix of old and new. The Air Force? Some biplanes still flying around like it was 1935, while British Hurricanes tore through the sky. Add a shortage of fuel, spare parts, and ground crews, and suddenly air support was basically a maybe. Then there was intelligence. The British could pick up Italian radio transmissions like kids reading gossip. They often knew exactly where the Italians were and where they were heading before the Italians even had a clue. All of this crushed morale. The soldiers weren't cowards. They fought like maniacs when they could, but they knew their tanks were coffins, their guns were jokes, and the sky above was unreliable. They were basically asked to fight a modern army with toys. The math was simple. They were going to get rolled. With leadership failing, supply lines broken, and men trapped in machines they couldn't trust, it was only a matter of time before the British struck.
And when that hit, the desert was about to swallow the 10th Army whole. For nearly 3 months, the Italian 10th Army sat idle in their fortified camps around Sidi Barrani. They waited. Graziani waited for pipelines. The soldiers waited. Meanwhile, the British were planning. And what they had in mind would make the Italians' frozen months look like child's play. The plan was called Operation Compass. On paper, it was just a 5-day raid. Push the Italians back, disrupt positions, destroy supplies, nothing more. But O'Connor's genius was in mobility and deception. He spotted the fatal flaw in the Italian defenses, a huge gap between the Nibaiwa camp and the Sofafi camps further west. While a small force pinned the Italians from the front, the main body, the 7th Armored Division and the 4th Indian Division, would slip through the gap at night and hit the camps from behind, the last place anyone expected. Morning of December 9, 1940, the storm hit. At Nibaiwa, dozens of British Matilda tanks rolled over defenses like an unstoppable tide. Italian anti-tank guns fired desperately, but their shells bounced harmlessly off the Matilda's thick armor. Panic spread. Soldiers ran in circles. Camp fell in hours. Over 2,000 Italians and Libyans were captured. British casualties, 56. The dominoes fell. Isolated and terrified, the other camps crumbled. The British, fast and relentless, never let up. What was meant to be a short raid became a complete collapse of the Italian front in 3 days. The retreat turned into a rout. Italian infantry, slow, unmotorized, exhausted, couldn't keep up. Surrounded and outmaneuvered, they surrendered by the thousands. And ironically, the British advance was fueled by the Italians themselves. Food, fuel, ammunition, and thousands of trucks fell into British hands. Supplies they desperately needed now powered their pursuit. Bardia fell. Tobruk fell. The 10th Army was no longer an army, just a desperate stream of refugees fleeing west. O'Connor wasn't done. With audacity bordering on madness, he sent Combe Force, a small wheeled column, across uncharted desert to cut the coast road at Bet Affan. It was a race against time. February 5th, Combe Force arrived, just 30 minutes before the Italian vanguard. 2 days of desperate fighting followed. Italian tanks made one final, hopeless charge on February 7th and were destroyed. The trap had closed. The 10th Army was surrounded. With nowhere to run, they surrendered.
In just 9 weeks, a force of 36,000 British soldiers had marched 500 miles, destroyed a 10-division army, and taken over 133,000 prisoners. They captured more than 400 tanks and 845 artillery pieces. The Italian 10th Army had effectively ceased to exist. It was one of the most complete and one-sided victories of the entire war. The reasons were clear, and they had been building for months. Italy's disaster rested on 3 cracked pillars: flawed leadership, from Mussolini's fantasies in Rome to Graziani's crippling caution in the field, a logistical system that collapsed under the strain of distance, lack of trucks, and relentless British attacks, and technological inferiority, which sent brave soldiers into battle with weapons that couldn't touch the enemy's tanks, guns, or planes. The consequences were enormous. Mussolini, humiliated, begged Hitler for help, a humiliating climb down that would change the course of the Desert War. This led to the arrival of the Afrika Korps under a then unknown general named Erwin Rommel, whose audacity would turn the North African desert into a battlefield for the next 2 years. Mussolini's dream of a new Roman Empire, once grand and shining in his mind, died in the sands of Egypt. From the sun-baked plains of Sidi Barrani to the final trap at Bet Affan, his ambitions were swallowed by the desert, a stark reminder that even the grandest dreams can be undone by hubris, incompetence, and the brutal realities of modern warfare. The Italian 10th Army was gone. Mussolini's empire was a mirage, and the desert had spoken, cruel, unyielding, and victorious.
Want more stories of epic battles, shocking blunders, and decisions that changed the course of history? Subscribe and hit the bell to join our weekly deep dives. Which Italian mistake surprised you the most? Mussolini's arrogance, the logistical collapse, or their outdated tanks? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one.
Thanks for watching.